We just finished installing 235 feet of vinyl privacy fence, as you can see behind me. I'm not a pro. I've never installed a fence in my entire life. Actually, I've never done much of any DIY projects until recently when we started building a house. I work on a computer at home all day. But after seeing examples of the shoddy work of local fence installers, we decided to save $5,000 and do it ourselves. How did we do it? We watched a few YouTube videos, like the one you're gonna watch now. So I'm gonna pay it forward. I'm gonna show you step by step how we installed this fence in such a way where we didn't have to cut or rip a single panel as we put each section together. It fit together perfectly. We installed the post on one day and then put all the section pieces together in only a couple hours on another day. And I live in an area where we have high winds during part of the year, so these posts are solid. They're not going anywhere. We're gonna show you how we built this fence to be very durable, but also look completely straight. Let's get to it.
The first step was to mark our property line and then grade the ground beneath it to have a very gradual slope from the front of our yard to the back of our yard because of local regulations where we were supposed to direct any water that gets in our lot to the back. So I used a combination of a pickaxe, a shovel, and a skid steer to get the grade finished. So then I marked with sticks every 6 feet where the posts would go so that I could measure the slope between the posts and make sure that it didn't drop by more than ½ an inch. So that way, even though the fence will gradually slope from the front of the lot to the back, it's going to look straight. I used a string level to make sure the line is level so I can properly measure the slope change. And then I measured the distance from the string to the ground every 6 feet to make sure we only dropped by 1/4 to ½ inch between posts. And just note, I'm not a landscaper, I'm not a professional fence installer, so I don't have fancy equipment like a laser level and other things that you could use to make this a little bit easier. So the equipment I'm using is something that anybody could go buy from Home Depot for really cheap. The next step before we start drilling the post holes was to call in blue stakes to come mark the utilities. This is extremely important so you don't end up drilling through an electrical line, a sewer pipe. Once this was marked, we realized that we needed to hand dig the 2 post holes nearest the house. Next, I assembled one section of fence on my deck to check the exact spacing between the posts. And I'm so glad I did this because it saved us countless hours during the install. Others that I had asked were telling me to put the posts 6 feet apart on center. But after assembling one section, I discovered that in order for the vertical panels to fit perfectly without having to rip pieces or cut small strips to add in, the posts needed to be 73 1/4 inches apart from center of post to center of post, not 72 inches. I cannot stress enough the importance of being meticulous with your measuring during this phase. An extra 30 seconds of measuring saved us 30 minutes of work later. Next, I moved the string line 2½ inches into my neighbor's property to mark where the back of the fence post will hit, because that way the center of the 5-inch post is on the property line. And that will also help us during the install so that when we're lining each fence post up, it all stays in a straight line. Then starting with the corner post, we marked with spray paint where each post needed to be dug. So we measured 2½ inches from the string towards our property to find the center of the hole, and then we measured exactly 73 1/4 inches from mark to mark. Tomorrow morning, we start drilling. This is a 36-inch auger attached to a tractor. We need to drill 30 inches deep to get below our frost line. We were able to borrow a neighbor's auger, but this is one tool you will need to rent unless you want to spend 50+ hours hand digging holes. Now, one mistake we made that resulted in me having to spend another 8 hours working on the holes is that we should have pushed the auger back in the hole after we hit our depth one last time and pop it out again just to remove the remainder of the dirt. The way that we did it is that we stopped once we hit the depth and we left the hole almost half filled with dirt that I had to then shovel out. Luckily, we had a week between drilling and installing the post, and so during that time I went through and dug out the loose dirt out of every hole, which was still a lot easier than if the dirt was compacted and undisturbed. And then I shoveled all the dirt around the hole away from it to clear a nice spot so that no more dirt would fall into the hole in the meantime, and so we can measure our ground level properly. My next step is to measure the distance between each hole to make sure the post fits in the proper position, because I noticed while drilling that sometimes the auger jumped a few inches off our mark. So I placed a post in each hole to check its positioning, to make sure it was close enough to the center so it would have enough concrete around it. I discovered while doing this that a few of our holes were off their mark and needed to be adjusted. Some of the posts, if placed at the position it needed to be, were hitting into the wall of the holes. So with a shovel and a post digger, I had to make a few holes bigger in order for the post to sit where it needed to be and have enough concrete around it to hold it in place. And in order to maintain the right distance between the posts, but also just barely tap into the string line, which would then keep the fence line straight. Again, a big reminder and lesson learned that a little extra time on each step prevents a lot of extra time having to fix it. If we had spent an extra 30 seconds with the auger on each hole to make sure we got more of that dirt out, and if we spent a few extra seconds making sure that we stayed on the spray painted mark, that would have saved me an extra 15 minutes per hole after the fact to have to dig that dirt out and adjust the few holes that I needed to that had gotten off their mark. So the extra 8 hours that I spent on the holes really didn't need to happen if we had taken a little extra time during the drilling process. After I was finished adjusting each hole, I re-measured everything to make sure that the holes were exactly where they needed to be, and then I filled each hole with 3 inches of gravel. This helps any moisture drain away from the concrete ball and prevent frost heaving, which you don't want. So after filling it with gravel, that brought our hole depth to right around 27 inches. Now these holes are 12 inches wide in diameter and 30 inches deep with the gravel that brings it up to 27 inches. And then when we go into the post setting process, I'll talk about how we manage the depth of each post properly. I did one last measurement of all the holes to make sure that we didn't have any surprises the day of setting the post, because if we did, having to adjust holes then would have taken a lot longer and interrupted the whole process with mixing concrete and getting each post set. Now all 40 holes are ready. And what you may have noticed is that we took the original string line off while we drilled, and then we reattached it to the metal stakes right before setting the posts. And a quick note about the placement of the string: we place it to where the back of the post will hit, and the height of the string is 4 inches above the ground, because we wanted it to match up with the bottom of the bottom rail of the posts to leave a 4-inch gap, because we're going to be adding about 2 inches of soil after the fact, which will then leave a 2-inch gap left over. But the string is no longer level. We adjusted it to follow the gradual slope of the ground so that we can make sure that each post is at the same depth. It's post setting day. The day before, we got a bunch of concrete delivered to our house from Home Depot. We bought 80-pound bags of Sacrete high-strength concrete mix. It works great. It was also a lot more economical than the 50-pound bags. We borrowed a portable electric concrete mixer from a neighbor, and it saved us a ton of time. So if you don't have one, I highly recommend you renting one so that you don't have to hand mix all of your concrete in a wheelbarrow. When you're mixing the concrete with water, just follow the instructions on the back of the bag to make sure you have the right consistency. After a couple of minutes of mixing, we emptied it into a wheelbarrow to transport it to each hole. Each hole needed about 2 80-pound bags of the concrete. After the concrete is poured, I grab my 2x4 stud that I cut earlier to exactly 68 1/4 inches, and I place it firmly against the previous post so I can find the right position of the current post. This method was much easier than having to grab my measuring tape each time, and I could do it alone. Then I grab the post, and if the consistency of the concrete is correct, the post should insert in with some pressure, but it shouldn't just fall into the concrete with gravity. That means you put in too much water. Now, if it's not going into the concrete with pressure from your hands on top of the post, then there wasn't enough water. Now, if the concrete was too firm, which for us it was just a couple of times, then we had to use 2 guys to pull down on the post or tap on it with a rubber mallet to get it deep enough. Now, to get the post in the right position, the side needed to barely press into the 2x4 stud, and then the back needed to barely touch the bottom string. Then for depth, we used the top string as a marker for where the top of the post needed to hit. It's going to produce a nice clean look across the top because the posts will all be fairly uniform where the tops of them are hitting. There's a lot of micro adjustments that you make in those first couple of minutes after pushing the post into the concrete. And don't cut any corners here. Once you get it to the proper depth, sometimes it moves away from the stud or the back of the string and you need to use a shovel as a lever to push the bottom of the post the other direction. Or you have to pull the post up, or you have to tilt it just slightly. And you're gonna be making all these micro adjustments in those first few minutes, and if you don't, you're gonna end up with a post that's not plumb, that's not level, that's tilted, that's in the wrong spot, and it's gonna mess things up when you're trying to install all the pieces. So we used a 4-foot level to make sure the post was plumb, and you must check 2 adjacent sides. So not opposite sides, you wanna make sure you're checking one side and then an adjacent side right next to it. That way you're making sure it's level side to side and the post is level front to back. You'll likely make a few more micro adjustments after checking with the level, because when you tilt the post to make it plumb, it can move it out of position from the stud or away from the string. Then once it's level on both sides and in the right position and the right depth, we start shoveling dirt over the top of the concrete. Remember, we made the hole deep enough so once the concrete was poured, we still had a few inches above the concrete before you hit ground level so that we could add dirt. The dirt helps to hold the post in place. After adding a few shovelfuls of dirt, we check with the level again, and with each layer of dirt, we lightly compact it with our feet, which sometimes shifts the post slightly, and so we have to adjust it again, and that's why you need to check several more times with the level to make sure your post is still plumb and that the position is still correct. Then once we're done backfilling with dirt, we check one last time with the level, and then we're good to go. Usually by this point, once you're done adding all the dirt, the post is still plumb and it's in the right position ongoing. The post should hold from this point on long enough for the concrete to set. But I do recommend you check with your level again, 10 minutes later, and then again, 20 minutes later, because after about 30 minutes, the concrete is set too much to be able to change anything, and then it's too late. So it's worth it to go back and check just in case, because it could get knocked by somebody, or maybe there's a wind gust. You want to double check within that first 30 minutes after placing the post in the concrete before it sets too much. We only had maybe 1 or 2 posts that a few minutes later moved slightly off plumb and it needed to be adjusted. And I think it was just because those were the holes where the concrete was too wet, and so the post would sink a bit deeper and I needed to pull it back up, or it would tilt a bit. I think that's what happened on those couple, but that's why you go back and check. When you set the posts like this, you do not need to use 2x4s to brace the posts like some people do. A lot of YouTube videos of people putting fence posts in will show them putting a bunch of wood around the post to keep it in place, but you do not need to waste the time doing that. The dirt on top of the concrete is plenty strong at holding the post in place. But that's why you're tapping the dirt with your foot as you're adding each layer to make sure it's compacted enough to hold that post in. We repeated this 40 times for all the posts. We were setting posts over about 2 days to work around some of the heavy winds that were coming in, but in total it took about 8 hours, with one guy mixing concrete, another moving the concrete back and forth with the wheelbarrow, and then me setting the posts into the concrete and checking with the level. This task would be difficult with one person. I suggest at least having 2 people. Then once we were done setting all of our posts, and we did one last final check of the recent posts that were put in to make sure they were still plumb, we let the posts cure for the next 2 days. You want to leave them alone for at least 24 hours, but 48 hours is best before installing the panels. It's day 4, finally time to install the rails and panels. Hopefully we did everything right, measuring our holes and setting the post, because this part of the process should go fairly smoothly, unless we messed up something with all of our measuring. Our goal is to not have to rip or add any vertical panels beyond the standard 6 because of having equal distances between the posts. And now we get to see if all that extra time measuring paid off. The first step is to grab the metal inserts which are included in the package. These inserts are in the shape of a U, and then you take a bottom vinyl rail, which is the same piece as the top rails, and you insert the metal bar into the bottom slot of the bottom rail, as you can see here. This metal insert helps to keep the bottom rail from bending under pressure, but it also acts as a support plate to protect the vinyl because the bottom rail is a lot more likely to get hit with something. As you can see, I lined up the closed side of the metal insert with the bottom of the vinyl rail and the open side facing up. You'll know what the bottom of the vinyl rail is because it's the closed in side, not the open grooved side. Now that your bottom rails are ready, it's time to install those first. Now, installing the bottom rail is by far the easiest part. You just slide one end down into the hole. These holes are supposed to be pre-routed by the supplier, and you insert it about 2 to 3 inches in, then push the other side down flat and insert that into the other hole. Try to make sure both ends are equally inserted into the holes. With the spacing we did of 68¼ inches between posts, each side of the rail should penetrate 1.5 inches into the post. And that's exactly what happened because we triple measured the spacing of our posts. We repeated this for all 40 sections and we didn't have to cut a single one to get it to fit. If you were to look inside the post from the top, you would see a 2-inch gap between the rails that allows you to remove these in the future more easily if you ever needed to replace one. By the way, I'm using National Vinyl products. It's a much higher quality vinyl than what you'd get from Home Depot. It's thicker, it's more durable, it only costs a little bit more. Next step is to install the U-channels. This is definitely the most time-consuming part of building the sections because you have to screw it in. Everything else just pops in. We used 3/4 inch self-tapping screws that were zinc coated to resist corrosion. To ensure you don't have gaps at the ends of the sections where you can see through to the neighbor's house, use 3 screws evenly spaced, not 2. Some people only put in 2. You put 1 screw a couple inches from the top, 1 in the center, and another a couple inches from the bottom. In order to position the U-channel correctly, you need to align the bottom of it with the bottom rail and just set it right on top. And then I found it was easiest to put the bottom screw in first while I was firmly holding the U-channel on top of the bottom rail, and then I aligned the top of the U-channel with the routed hole at the top of the post, and I put that screw in. Then I made sure it was flatly pressed against the post, and then I put the middle screw in. You could also put in the middle screw second as well. I did that a few times in case you're worried about not having it flatly pressed against the post. At first I was using a level to make sure the U-channel was plumb, but I soon found out that it was too much to fumble with, and by aligning the U-channel with the routed out rail holes and just eyeballing it, I was able to get it straight, and it saved a bit of time as well. About an hour later, I finally got all the U-channels screwed in. Again, this is the first time I've ever done something like this. I'm sure when we install the fence on the other side of our yard, it'll go faster. But this goes to show that anyone can learn to do anything themselves if they're willing to and watch informative YouTube videos like this one. Now we're on the final step. This is by far the easiest and quickest and most satisfying part of the whole process. We start on the left and slide the first panel down the U-channel and into the opening on the top of the bottom rail. Then with the next panel, you insert the tongue of the next panel into the groove of the previous one, and then slide it down a few inches into the gap. And the final panel usually goes in fairly snug, which is what you want. You don't want it too loose where there's a gap, but you also don't want it so tight that you can't get it down into the slots and you end up having to cut it. So make sure you get it into that other U-channel on the other post, and then push it all the way down. This is where we got to discover that the extra time we spent measuring and remeasuring when digging holes and placing the posts paid off. We didn't have to cut a single rail or vertical panel to get them to fit. Each section took exactly 6 of these vertical panels. Even the end of our fence, which was only a 4-foot section, didn't need ripping of the panels because 4 of them exactly fit. We still had to cut down the bottom and top rails, of course, but that was easy. A lot of fences, if you look closely, each section is a slightly different width because they didn't take that time to measure it exactly. If you're gonna have a section that's shorter, put that section towards the back so you don't really see it. Then when people look at your fence, all they see is a bunch of 6-foot equal spaced sections and it looks really nice. And once your vertical panels are in, you can install the top rail. You just start on one side, putting the top rail at an angle, pushing it deep enough into the hole to then get the other side down and then slide it over into the hole so it's equally penetrating both sides of the posts. And it should fit just like the bottom rail did, where it's penetrating about 1.5 inches into each post. The top rail should fit together really nicely over the tops of the vertical panels. As you can see here, each vertical panel is slightly lower than the next one because our fence has a gradual slope to follow the grade of our lot, but the fence looks perfectly straight. This part of the process only took an hour. It's fun seeing what doesn't look like a fence with all these posts so quickly being a completed fence. Most of the time people spend countless more hours installing these panels because they didn't spend the extra couple minutes measuring their fence post spacing, and so they have to keep ripping down panels along the way or adding small pieces to get it to fit. That's what we wanted to avoid, and we successfully did it. We finished with the steeper slope up to our house and also installed the gate. The gate posts were 4 feet apart instead of 6, and we also had to put a steel metal insert into each gate post for extra durability, but also so you can fasten the gate hardware. Now, to get the top rail to fit properly on the steeper slope, we needed to cut the tops of the vertical panels at an angle so that top rail can fit down onto it. And that's the case with any steeper slope. We finished installing the panels on the final stretch. We won't get into the details of installing the gate. There's plenty of good videos you can find on that. And as you can see, we made the 2 gate posts level to make for an easier gate install, and it makes it so it can swing open without issues. But after the gate was done, the final step, the finishing touch, are the post caps. They just press easily onto the top. Make sure to tap them in so they're secure. And there you have it. First timer DIY vinyl fence install. Every section is equal, it looks totally straight, and we saved thousands of dollars. Our hope is that you can be empowered to install your own fence by simply watching this video. Again, if I can do it, anyone can do it. I'll see you in the next homeowner build.